In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove the factory rear fender from your KTM RC390 and replace it with the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit. First off, let me go over some of the key details for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator for the KTM RC390. It is made from CNC laser cut and CNC bent 1/8 inch thick 5000 series aluminum. It's finished in UV resistant satin black powder coat. It comes pre-installed with stainless steel studs for a totally flush underside appearance and no loose hardware. It includes a zip tie mount and rubber bumpers to minimize any kind of buzzing you get from the license plate. It's designed to retain the DOT certified turn signals and license plate light from your RC390. It also includes 2 zip ties, one to mount your wiring harness on the fender eliminator itself and one to replace a zip tie on the bike that you're going to have to cut. Now, most of the tools you'll need for this installation are actually included in the KTM tool pack under your seat of the RC390. You'll need a 4 and a 5mm Allen key, a 14 and a 10mm wrench, and a Phillips screwdriver. You also need something to trim the zip ties after installation. For this you can use dikes or a knife if that's what you've got. For this video I'm also going to use a 10mm socket and 4mm Allen key in the power driver just to speed things up, but you don't need to use them. Now the first step is going to be to remove the rider and passenger seat from the motorcycle. Get the rider seat off, and use the key in the side of the frame and remove that. Next, you can take your tool pack out if you want to use those tools. And then last, you're going to use a 5mm Allen key to remove the rear rider seat. Now, it's just a single bolt, and it has, just so you know, it has a shoulder washer on it that you're going to want to keep track of. There you go. You're just going to slide the seat forward and set that aside. The next step is going to be to unhook the electrical connectors that go to your rear fender. To start, you're going to have to trim or cut the zip tie that is bundling your rear wire harness up to the subframe. Then you can go and separate the big black rubber boot that's covering the connectors you need to disconnect. And the ones you're interested in, there's not that big green one, but these small connectors, the green, gray, and red. That's going to be your turn signals and your license plate light. Now once those are done, you're actually ready to take off the rear fender. Now to remove the factory rear fender, you're going to unscrew the 4 10mm nuts on these 4 studs, and that's going to drop the whole rear fender out the back. I would recommend putting a shop towel or another clean towel in your intake snorkel so you don't risk dropping anything, and I'd be extra cautious not to drop any of these nuts down into the subframe, else they'd be a little difficult to retrieve. So I'm going to use a 10mm socket, and the easiest way I've found is just to unscrew them until they get really easy and the locking part is off the stud, and then they're pretty easy to remove by hand. You just have to move the intake snorkel out of the way whenever you need to. Obviously for the last one, you want to go a little slower and be careful to support the rear fender so it doesn't just fall out. And once you've got that 4th nut off, you should be able to gently pull rear fender out. Let me clear some stuff out of the way here. Now, the last part is just going to be pushing through the red, green, and gray connectors out of that kind of oval grommet in the rear frame. Now that we've got the rear fender off, we can take that to the bench and break it down. The first step to taking apart your factory rear fender is going to be to remove your license plate from the frame, and I think every dealer is going to do this a little bit differently. In this case, we do have flathead screws, which are also on the toolkit screwdriver, or on the flip side of that. So remove your plate, then you're going to have 4 of the 4mm Allen screws to remove, and that's going to get this plastic plate off, but also allow you to remove the steel frame from the rear fender. So once that's off, one thing to note is the rear fender is going to have 4 steel spacers on it, and we're actually going to reuse those. That keeps good metal to metal contact when we reinstall, instead of clamping through plastic. So be sure to keep track of those and set them aside. To get the rear fender apart, the last step is going to be to remove these 2 Phillips head screws, and that's going to allow you to get to both your license plate light and your turn signals. So we're not going to reuse these, but you may want to keep them and put your rear fender back to stock at some point, so keep track of them if you want. Once you've got those 2 out, you can separate the frame and the plastic shell, and you'll notice that the wires go through the steel tube on the rear fender, so you're gonna get those out of your factory rear fender. You can set that aside. And then the last step is going to be to take the turn signals and license plate light off. Now for the factory turn signals, you're going to use the 14mm open end wrench to loosen the nuts at the back side of each turn signal. And you're going to reuse all this hardware, so keep track of it. And when you get the nut loose, you're going to pull the wire harness through everything. So the order of operation for these guys is the large flat washer, the serrated lock washer, and then the flange nut for reinstallation. So keep all that hardware. And then the last step to taking apart your rear fender is going to be to use the Phillips head screwdriver and remove the 2 screws that are going into your license plate light. And we are going to reuse these, so keep track of them. And you can just pull that back through the hole. Now at this point we're ready to reinstall all these lights back into the fender eliminator. Now the first thing you can do is you can remove these black plastic stud protectors once you get the fender eliminator. Those are just to protect the packaging from getting torn up from the studs in transport. So the first thing you're going to do is start with the license plate light. You're going to thread that through the central hole and kind of line it up, and then you should be able to start both the screws by hand. And keep in mind, this is threading into plastic, so you don't need to tighten these very tight. So we use the toolkit Phillips screwdriver, and there's just enough angle to get to these guys. So I got these nice and snug, and it's much easier if you start with the license plate light and then do your turn signal second. So next you're going to do your turn signals, and in this case they are labeled right and left on the underside, but in any case gray is for right and green is for left. And you'll notice the KTM turn signals have the 10mm stud, but then they also have a little plastic boss, and that boss is going to line up with the hole in your fender eliminator so that the turn signals are going to be clocked at an appropriate angle. And so once you get it threaded through the fender eliminator, you're going to take your washer stack, that's a flat washer, serrated washer, and then the flange nut, and run it back over. You can get it started on the stud, and then it's important that you key that turn signal in so that it stays flush when you tighten it and is keyed in the right direction, pointing backwards. Do that for the other turn signal. And you're going to use your 14mm wrench to tighten these guys. And they shouldn't rotate because of that boss, but it's always good to keep a hand on them so that they don't. Then you're going to thread your 3 wiring looms through this oval slot in the fender eliminator, and that's going to line up really well with the oval grommet that's already installed in your rear stub frame. It's a nice little feature KTM put in there so that the wires aren't going to rub. So one thing we have supplied is there's a little zip tie mount at the bottom of the fender eliminator in this view, and you're going to take one of your supplied zip ties and you're going to thread it through the channel at the bottom of this, and you're going to use that to secure all your wires so that they don't pull out of your fender eliminator. And for now you can get it just a little snug, and then what you're going to want to do is get them all nice and tidy and make sure there's no slack and get them pretty snug. And you can clip that before you put it on the bike. So we're ready to put the fender eliminator back on the motorcycle. You can see we've clipped that zip tie flush, so you don't have to do that once it's already on the bike. Now, like I mentioned, you are going to have those 4 spacers that came off the factory fender, those little cylindrical steel spacers. And you don't absolutely have to do this, but I do recommend it because then what it gives you is a very strong metal-to-metal contact at the frame mounts rather than clamping through plastic. So you kind of reduce the risk of ever cracking or tweaking that plastic. So once those go on, and this is where having the 4 studs pressed in rather than loose hardware really is a heck of a lot easier. So to get the fender eliminator on, you're going to reverse the process that you use to take the factory fender off. And that is, you start by threading through your 3 electrical connectors. You're going through that rubber grommet in the subframe. You're going to pull those through. And then you're going to line up the 4 studs in the fender eliminator and slide that through as well. Now at this point, you can install, start with by hand, the 4 nuts. Once again, you're going to have to kind of push the intake snorkel out of the way to make the spacing easy. And once you got all 4 of those 10mm nuts on, at least a few threads by hand, you can go ahead and use your 10mm socket to tighten them up. At that point, you're gonna be sure to remove the rag you put in your intake snorkel, and you're going to go about reconnecting all the electrical connectors for the turn signals and the license plate light. And that's as simple as matching colors for the 3 that we have disconnected earlier. And you're going to pull, and you're going to have to tuck that big green one back in as well. And you're going to pull that rubber boot back over all these, and that's just going to give that a little extra layer of protection. Now you notice you have a bit more cable length for the turn signals and license plate light than you did before the fender eliminator. So the goal of this is going to be to use the same zip tie mount and the second supplied zip tie, and create a service loop and rebundle all the wires very similarly to how they were from the factory. And all you're trying to accomplish with this is to keep all this loose wiring from getting in the way of, 1, of closure of your passenger seat, and 2, from rubbing on anything and potentially rubbing through the insulation. So once you get a feel for what is reasonable, and you certainly want to keep track of this big connector, get it out of the way, as well as this is your cable for your seat lock, so everything should kind of sit at least cleanly on top of each other. Give that zip tie a snug pull, and then you're going to use your flush cutters to clean it all up. So once you're sure that your bundled wiring is not going to interfere with the passenger seat closing, you can slide it back onto its kind of hook mount and use your 5mm Allen wrench. And this is sometimes takes a little bit of eyeballing. A little bit of pressure at the top of your seat. And that's it. And the last step is going to be to put your rider seat back on, and that just obviously mounts to those little posts, and that's the key to release. So you can also put your tools. There we go. Just the last finishing step is going to be to install your license plate light. You'll reuse whatever hardware the dealership put on there. And once you do that, it's really important to do a kind of full system check to make sure everything's working. So you cycle the key, or turn the key on. You can see we've got our license plate light as well as the really nice kind of center stripe on the brake light. You've got a left turn and right turn. At that point, you're going to want to make sure all your connections are tight and you are ready to go. At this point, we are all complete with the installation of the fender eliminator on the RC390. Got a couple views of the clearance between the turn signals and the body, as well as the clearance between the fender eliminator and license plate light and the rear tail light. I'd like to say thank you for watching this video. Hopefully it was helpful, and I'd encourage you to check us out either at our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com, or our products can also be found on Amazon or eBay. Thank you very much.